So let's have a talk about budget builds. Budget builds are something that used to be a relatively common thing in Path of Exile, but nowadays there's not so many of them anymore. Now, I know the term budget gets thrown around a lot, just like the term average player, and probably your definition of average player is going to be substantially different from my definition of average player, and that definition is going to be different from every other single person. So budget is kind of one of those words that's very similar like that. It's up to interpretation. So here is my interpretation of a budget build. I'm talking about a build that is only using some very easy and cheap to get uniques. I'm talking about 5 chaos maximum for a unique no matter how popular the build gets, as well as some easy to find rares that can just drop on the ground and you can craft something on them on your bench. We're talking about like life and resists. No farmed in like essence crafted gear or harvest crafted gear or recombobulators or this or that, or none of that, right? We're talking about very simple gear. That is what I mean when I say a budget build. This is something that used to exist. There used to be a lot of them, probably about a year and a half ago. Nowadays, not so much the case. So when I make this giant claim of like budget builds are a trap, you're probably like, well, I've played a ton of builds in the last, I don't know, year or so that have been able to do, tier 16 maps and such on a budget. Obviously budget builds still exist, right? And yes, if your definition of in-game content is going to be doing tier 16 maps, then by all means, there's a ton of builds that can do tier 16 maps on a budget. But there's a big difference now compared to about a year and a half ago. When I think of a budget build back from somewhere like 3.13, budget builds could do all of the content that was available. That's definitely not the case anymore. So we're gonna talk about a few things in this video. We're gonna talk about how we got from budget builds being able to do most content to where budget builds are like, able to clear like tier 16 maps maybe sometimes, and there's only really a handful of them. And then we're gonna talk about how if you're one of those players that just used to enjoy just tossing together a build, doing most of the content with it and moving on, that the game doesn't really work super well for you, and some things that you can do to kind of shift yourself into a better way of playing the game, and how I did that as well. Remember boys, if you're enjoying this content, make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest videos. Without further ado, let's get into it. So to begin our journey into history, we're going to have to go back almost 2 years, not exactly 2 years, but almost to a league called 3.11 Harvest League. This is the point where a hardcore ARPG made by some dudes in a garage was starting to transition into more of a open and friendlier game that gave people a lot of agency over what they were able to do. This is the point where Path of Exile kind of started to shift. Harvest League made it so that crafting insanely powerful gear was no longer just in the hands of the top 0.01%, it was in the hands of everyone. And although there were a lot of problems with the initial release of Harvest, over the course of the next few patches, it was honed down to the state that it was in 3.13. Now, a lot of people would say that 3.13 was the golden age of Path of Exile. I would say that that is true for the casual player. For a casual player, 3.13 was basically as good as it ever got. It was a patch where there was plenty to do. There were a ton of builds that were able to do basically all of the content of the game on a budget. Gear was very easy to create. You could have some of the most powerful items in the game as long as you just followed a simple guide of like, hey, do these steps and do these things to your item. And you can have a crazy explodey chest that just trivializes all mapping content. And then if you wanted to play a bossing build, there were a handful of them that you could just toss together a character with like 50 chaos worth of gear and be able to do most bosses in the game, albeit a little bit slowly, but you could still do it. And when it came to mainstream appeal, this is where I feel that PoE peaked. However, it seems like the devs over at Grinding Gear Games at GGG didn't really like the way that the game was headed. When they originally created this game, they thought, well, we really want this like hardcore, kind of unfair, deep, dark, role-playing ARPG fantasy type game, right? That's the kind of game that they wanted. And from 3.13 all the way to where we are now, there has been this massive shift in the way that they are trying to get people to play their game. Let's talk about it. In 3.13, Harvest was in the most powerful state that it had ever been. You didn't need to worry about the garden anymore. You just went in, you killed some plots of monsters, you got all the crafts, and you were able to use them on your gear. Nice, right? Very, very good for average player. Very, very good for basic casual players. In 3.14, we got the Harvest Manifesto, which I think just about everybody was upset with. There were some like high-end crafters who were like, huh, the peasants can't have the crafts anymore, who were, you know, probably happy about it. But I think most people were like, well, that's kind of unfortunate because Harvest was kind of like opening Pandora's box. And Chris said this himself. He was like, well, we're kind of just, you know, experimenting here. We might be opening something that we can never really close again. We're giving people all these really super powerful crafting options. And if we make this experiment, we can't really go back on it, right? And he was very, very correct. People were very upset when they changed Harvest to basically not be even close to as good as it was before. They made all of the powerful crafts extremely rare to the point where I haven't seen 90% of them since they made this change in Harvest. I don't do Harvest that much, but I still haven't seen it even once. They also made it so that you can't use the Harvest crafting stuff on influence gear. They also removed a bunch of the crafts. They did a whole bunch of stuff. This was not super well received, but 3.14 was Ultimatum League, and Ultimatum League was all right. We had some crazy monkey shenanigans where they were, you know, getting in giant groups of auras and kind of overpowering people, and Ultimatum was pretty difficult, but, you know, people weren't super upset. They're like, okay, well, I guess, you know, it was fun while it lasted. And then we got 3.15, which was Expedition League, and this is probably the most universal hated patch that they have ever released in the history of this game. This was the nerf patch. This was the patch where they decided to take a lot of power out of the gems and the skill tree and essentially put it nowhere. They didn't put any other buffs to any other kind of gear. They didn't give us any other choices to do anything. They're just like, well, we're just gonna nerf pretty much all of the game. Like, everybody's gonna be weaker now, and yeah, so enjoy that. We're making the campaign harder for some arbitrary reason. And, you know, well, because they did all of that, 30% of the player base just up and left. And they were like, huh, maybe this is a bad idea. Let's go on some podcasts and talk to a bunch of people and see if we can figure things out. And they did, and there was a lot of discussion, and that led us to 3.16, which was the defensive overhaul in the mastery system. This is probably the best comeback patch that we've ever had in Path of Exile's history. So they have taken away Harvest, meaning that it is harder to craft big crazy items. They have taken away the power from gems, as well as taken away a lot of power from the tree. And then they've made it so that people can now actually invest in defenses, and they need to invest in defenses because it feels good to not die, right? And all of these three things accomplish one very specific goal. They slowed down the progression of players trying to get to that point where they're like speed clearing, where they're just able to absolutely annihilate everything. They can just jump on their character, kill things off screen before they're even able to see them, and that was their major goal. Now, there's a problem at this point. That's all fine and dandy. That's their vision for the game. They want to have people have to invest money into their characters, invest time, effort, currency, and all of that. But it turns out currency is a little hard to make for most people. And then we get 3.17, the Atlas rework. The Atlas has changed, we have the new Atlas skill tree, and now, hey, it's actually possible for pretty much anybody, as long as they have some very basic knowledge, to be able to farm a bunch of currency and invest into a build. So with all of these things in place, it has changed the game from being a game where pretty much any build that you want to play, you can just toss some gear at it and it can probably do most of the content, as long as it is a relatively acceptable skill, to a point where, well, if you want to play anything that is not a cutthroat 100% meta-defining build, you're gonna have to spend 20, 30, 40, maybe 50 exalts to get it to be able to do most of the content in the game. Content is also harder, and that is where we've ended up now. We're in a situation where you have to invest into your character for it to be powerful. You can't just toss together some random gear and have it be super powerful now because you don't have harvest crafts and such, so you gotta actually invest into it. They've taken the power out of the gem choices as well as the skill tree. There's not as much damage and not as much player power built into those just simple choices that you can buy from a vendor. They've given you ways that you can actually invest into defenses, because if you weren't aware, before 3.16, basically, if you were playing on softcore, your defenses were 6 portals and that was about it. You just wanted to do absolutely as much damage as you possibly could so that the enemies would die before you did. However, with 3.16, now, you know, investing into defenses actually works. So you want to do that, right? That's the third thing. And then in 3.17, they make it, well, now you can actually farm currency pretty easily. So with all these things taken into account, budget builds are kind of a trap now, because if you find somebody that's making like a guide or something like that, and they're like, yeah, this build can do all content on a budget, you might be able to believe them, but the vast majority of builds in PoE at this point cannot say that. There's only a handful, and these are like the most absolutely degenerate meta builds. We're talking like seismic traps, EA ballista totems, and like some summoner builds basically, and even those need some money invested into them nowadays. And the problem is that depending on how popular those kinds of builds get and what items that they end up using, even they can be expensive. I know there were a ton of people that started Righteous Fire this league and were kind of upset that some of the Righteous Fire gear to scale into the in-game stuff was just like overwhelmingly expensive, but it just kind of is how Ray class works now. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not super excited about this transition that the game has made from kind of being like full of agency with players being able to just kind of play whatever build they want and have it be powerful, to where you really have to invest time, money, and effort into it. I'm not extremely happy about that because I was one of those people who liked playing a whole bunch of builds and just throwing a little bit of currency at it and having fun with it. But now, since Path of Exile is a game that I really do enjoy and I really do love, I make content for and everything else, I've kind of had to transition into, you know, well, I gotta start spending money and currency on all my builds. So at the end of the day, what does this mean for you? If you were one of those people who just kind of enjoyed throwing a bit of currency at a build, it didn't need to be a lot, you just wanted to have a very basic budget build, try to mess with that, and then move on to a new character, the way that you play the game and the way that I played the game previously doesn't really exist anymore. And I know a lot of the people who originally, you know, followed me for that are simply no longer playing the game. So I've kind of had to transition, and you probably, if you want to continue playing the game and enjoying it, are going to have to transition too. Now we have the tools available to us to be able to more easily and more straightforward gain the currency and invest it into a build without having to try to do some crazy big brain strategy and all kinds of stuff. Nowadays, you can simply just go into some maps, pop some altars, set your Atlas tree up a specific way, and just run maps, and you can make a good amount of currency. Previously, that wasn't the case. You'd have to do some weird, like, eclectic strategy about, like, you know, like doing all kinds of crazy stuff to be able to get decent currency. But that's not the case any longer. You can farm it just kind of by existing. So my suggestion is that if you are one of those players that used to enjoy playing budget builds, try investing a little bit more currency into each build that you play. We're talking 10, 20 Exalt, and spend the time of actually just sitting down and being like, all right, well, I need to learn how to make some more currency. I can do this, I can do that. I've got a heist guide that I put out recently. I tend to do a decent amount of heisting when I'm looking for larger amounts of currency. I farmed up enough money to buy an Ashes in, I don't know, 5 to 10 hours. If you can't find 5 to 10 hours to play the game, unfortunately, the game might just not be for you anymore. And that is extremely unfortunate. I don't like saying that, but it's what GGG wants. And unfortunately, I don't really have a lot of control over that. So at the end of the day, Path of Exile is a different game than it was about a year and a half ago, but it's not necessarily a bad game. I think that 3.13 was probably my favorite time ever in Path of Exile for the way that I enjoyed playing it, but 3.17 was probably my second favorite time ever in Path of Exile. And let's not talk about 3.18 and how they kind of broke a lot of the base game stuff. You know, have you guys tried to like Sentinel empower some expedition mobs yet? Kind of a little bit spooky. But remember, boys, if you're enjoying this content, make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest videos, and stay safe out there in Ray class. And I'll see you guys in the next video.